If that is not the most suspicious thing, I just don't know what is. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please do subscribe, and if you're old here, hello again. My name's Kate Philpott and we do true crime on this channel. As you can tell, probably from the very gruesome title I'm gonna put on this. Oh boy. Well, today's case is gonna just ruin your life. I'm sorry. It is a very controversial one, and it's one where people are very much split. I don't want to say split down the middle because I do feel like the majority of people have a particular opinion, but we'll get to that. It is definitely one of the more gruesome cases that I've covered, so yeah, I'll let you know when those kind of details are coming, but until then, I suppose let's get into it. So this is the case of the MacDonald family killings, and we are in for a wild, bumpy ride. But before I get to any of those details, I have to introduce you to Jeffrey MacDonald, and he was born in Queens, New York in 1943. Now, Jeffrey had a very successful high school career. He was voted most popular and most likely to succeed. He was also senior class president and captain of the football team. And on top of all that, his grades were pretty damn good as well. And they were so good, in fact, that he was offered a scholarship to Princeton University, which, I mean, that's a pretty big deal. Even I know Princeton University. His girlfriend was Colette Catherine Stevenson, and they were pretty much high school sweethearts. And in 1963, they actually found out that they were expecting a baby. So naturally, they got married because in the 60s, that's what you did. So their daughter Kimberly was born in April of 1964. And also in 1964, they moved to Chicago, where Jeffrey was accepted to Northwestern University Medical School. Their second child, Kristen, was born in May of 1967. And then the following year, he graduated from medical school and went on to complete an internship in a medical center in New York. In July of 1969, Jeffrey joined the US Army, and the whole family moved to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where he held the rank of captain. He was assigned to the 6th Special Forces Group in September 1969 as a group surgeon. That was all very difficult to say. So soon after this, Colette fell pregnant with their third child, which would be their first son. So as you can see, Jeffrey was like a success story from the word go. He had the perfect high school career, good grades, captain of the football team, the high school sweetheart, now the beautiful children, and expecting another baby on the way. So like everything was just, oh, and the career, of course. Everything was just fine and dandy, like the American dream from the word go. But then on the 17th of February 1970, everything would change. It was 3:42 a.m. when Jeffrey called 911 and reported a stabbing. 4 military police officers arrived on the scene, and they kind of just expected to be resolving a domestic dispute of some sort. It didn't exactly go that way. When they got to the house, the front door was locked. There was no sign of forced entry or anything, and the house was just pitch black. There were no lights on, no nothing. So they circled around to the back of the house, and the back door was wide open, although there was a screen door that was closed in front of it, but the screen door wasn't locked. So naturally they entered the house and they came across a blood-curdling scene, to put it lightly, honestly. So just to warn you, this is where things get graphic. There was silence in the house, so they started to search the rooms. And first of all, they went into Kimberly's room. Now remember, Kimberly is a 5-year-old, and they found her in her bed having been clubbed several times and stabbed in the neck with a knife 8 to 10 times. They continued to search the house in case there was anything else wrong, and they entered Kristen's room. And remember, Kristen was only 2 years old at this point. She was also in her bed, and she had been stabbed 33 times with a knife and 15 times with an ice pick. Then they entered Jeffrey and Colette's room, and at this point Colette is 4 to 5 months pregnant, but unfortunately she was lying dead on the floor as well. She had been repeatedly clubbed, and she was stabbed 21 times with an ice pick, 16 times with a knife, and both of her arms were broken. Also, on the headboard behind the bed, the word pig was written in blood, which, I mean, obviously the nature of these crimes would tell you that this person either didn't value these people's lives or just was very angry or something, but I just feel like that is so disrespectful. But on top of Colette was Jeffrey's pajama top, and it was like kind of ripped up a little bit, and lying beside Colette was Jeffrey, and he was alive, but he definitely was injured. He had cuts and bruises on his face and his chest. He had a mild concussion and a stab wound on his left torso that a surgeon described as a clean, small, sharp incision. And this incision did cause his left lung to partially collapse. So, I mean, he definitely was cut up. He was in hospital for about a week, so it's not like he was hanging on for dear life or anything like that. Okay, so what the hell happened here? Like, this doesn't just happen by accident. What's going on? So Jeffrey's account of that night, he basically says that he fell asleep on the couch that evening because Kristen had been in bed with Colette and she wet his side of the bed, so he was like, ugh, right, we'll deal with it tomorrow, I'm gonna sleep on the couch. Then he wakes up to Colette and Kimberly's screams in the middle of the night. So obviously he runs in and he wants to see what all the fuss is about, and he's attacked by 3 male intruders. And while he's being attacked, he notices a 4th intruder, which is a blonde woman. She's got long blonde hair and she's holding a candle and chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." What is this? So Jeffrey says that he was attacked by the 3 men with a club and an ice pick, and in the struggle his pajama top started to come off, so it was essentially wrapped around his wrists and he was basically using that to defend himself from the ice pick. Eventually then he was knocked unconscious, and that's all he remembers from that night. So into the investigation. The Army's Criminal Investigation Division just straight up did not believe Jeffrey's story. They wanted to obviously check it out somewhat objectively, so they looked at the physical evidence, and what this evidence told them was definitely different to what Jeffrey told them. So it was the living room that Jeffrey had supposedly fought off these 3 men, but there wasn't really much sign of a struggle other than like an overturned coffee table and a knocked over plant. And fibers from his pajama top weren't even found in the living room where he claimed it was torn. They were actually found in a couple other places. There were fibers found under Colette's body and in Kimberly and Kristen's bedroom, and there's actually one fiber found under Kristen's fingernail. Furthermore, Kimberly's blood was actually found on this pajama top, even though Jeffrey claimed that he wasn't wearing it when he was in her room. Moving on. The murder weapons were found outside the house, just outside the back door. So a kitchen knife, an ice pick, and a 3-foot piece of lumber, all of which were determined to have come from inside the house. So authorities basically came up with this timeline that was based on the physical evidence, on statistics, and just how everything was. So assuming only 4 people were bleeding in the house, they theorized that a fight broke out between Jeffrey and Colette in the master bedroom, and they speculated that from here it turned physical, with Colette hitting Jeffrey over the head with a hairbrush, which caused his concussion. Jeffrey then retaliated by hitting her, first of all with his fists, but then with this 3-foot piece of lumber. Whoa, Jeffrey. But then Kimberly's blood and brain serum were found in the doorway, which tells us that maybe she heard the commotion and walked in and was struck, maybe even accidentally, at least once in the head. Then at this point, believing Colette to be dead, Jeffrey picked Kimberly up and brought her to her room and stabbed her to finish the job, which just sounds horrible. I'm so sorry. From here, he supposedly went into Kristen's room to get rid of the last witness, I guess. But before he could do that, Colette somehow, she wasn't dead, she stumbled in and threw herself over Kristen. And the reason they thought this was because they found Colette's blood on Kristen's bed covers and on a wall in the room, so she must have regained consciousness at this point. Then they believe that Jeffrey went on to kill both of them, and he wrapped Colette's body in a sheet and brought her into the master bedroom and put her on the floor. The reason they believe this is because there was a smudged footprint on the way out of Kristen's room. Ooh, okay. So at this point, Jeffrey finds some surgical gloves, puts them on, and writes pig on the headboard with Colette's blood. He lays his torn pajama top on top of Colette and stabs her multiple times with the ice pick. And then from here, he grabs a scalpel blade, takes himself into the bathroom and stabs himself once in the chest. He then calls the ambulance, gets rid of the gloves and the scalpel blade, puts the murder weapons outside the back door, and lays on the ground beside Colette. So on the 6th of April 1970, so bear in mind this is about 2-3 weeks later, he's interrogated by the army investigators, and about a month later, if even, he was charged with the murder of his family. But the annoying part here is they did not handle the crime scene well at all. Like, they lost several pieces of key evidence, like the tips of the surgical gloves. Obviously, whoever used these gloves had cut the tips off, so there were no fingerprints inside them, and these tips were now gone. And a single layer of skin that was found under Colette's fingernails was also gone. So these are such important things that we need to hold on to in this scenario, and they were just gone. Okay, I'm gonna just take a step back here and say my main fascination with true crime and everything is more so around the psychology of it, and there is a lot of legal back and forth and jargon and stuff that like I don't really personally understand or excel in, so I have just tried to summarize it in a way that it makes sense and you're getting the most important details. Yeah, I'm not giving all of the details because I just feel like it's a little too heavy and it would literally be 3 hours long. But also I will leave all the sources down below if you want to look into that kind of stuff a bit more. All right, let's get into the autopsies. Again, with the autopsies, there was so much information, and I did just try to pick out the most important and most interesting parts of it, but again I'll leave that in the description if you want to look into it in a bit more detail. So we'll start off with Colette. Colette died due to blood loss resulting from the multiple stab wounds to the neck and chest, and they did find evidence that she had had sex in the 72 hours prior to her death because they found sperm inside her. And I just would love to know if it was definitely Jeffrey's or if it was somebody else's. They didn't test this sperm, so I think they just presumed it was Jeffrey's and that was that. But I just feel like if Jeffrey did it, they don't have a motive, so that could have helped in that way. But again, it could have just been his, so we don't know. There's also a small amount of alcohol in her blood, and she was at 0.3 milligrams per mil, which is like just above the driving limit. Not a lot. You'd be able to function fine and everything with the amount that was in her system. And they found no evidence of drugs. They couldn't figure out an exact time of death for Colette, but they estimated that it was probably somewhere around 3 a.m. Okay, on to Kimberly. So Kimberly's cause of death was also blood loss. Her nose was broken and deviated to the left, and her jaw was also fractured. Again, they couldn't determine an exact time of death, but they estimated that it was somewhere between the evening of the 16th of February and when Jeffrey made that call. And that's interesting because, I mean, they're basically saying that it's possible that she was dead far earlier than the other two victims. And if that is the case, that throws the whole timeline for a loop. If she was killed on the evening of February the 16th and then the other two weren't killed until 3:30 in the morning, that it just could be a whole other situation. Okay, on to Kristen. I'm gonna just read this first part because the language is like very medical. The neck and trachea showed minor spaced hemorrhage and the intratrachea blood was not clotted. So basically this would suggest that the stab wounds to her neck, trachea and chest were sustained after she died or in the final stages of death. Again, for Kristen, they couldn't determine a definite time of death, but they did say that she also could have been killed in the evening of February the 16th or right up until when he made that call. So again, what if both children were killed in the evening and then Colette wasn't killed until the middle of the night? Like, that would change the whole dynamic of the timeline as well. It's probably not likely, but it definitely can't be ruled out, so I just think it is very interesting to think about. So overall, Dr. Neal, who carried out the autopsies, he said that by the time he was doing his examination, there had been a distinct cooling of the bodies, and that would suggest that they had been dead for at least an hour to when he was doing his examination. And I'm not sure of the exact time he did his examination, but it was pretty soon after the authorities arrived on the scene initially. Alright, let's get into what we're gonna do about all this. So the army had an initial Article 32 hearing, which don't even ask me what that is, I don't know, into Jeffrey's possible guilt. And this went on for 6 weeks. Jeffrey was represented by Bernard L. Segal, I don't know how to pronounce that, but Segal's defense, Jesus, concentrated on the fact that the investigation was of a pretty low quality, and also the fact that there were other suspects, specifically a girl called Helena Stokely. So she was 17 years old at the time of the murders, and she was supposedly this blonde woman with the candle. Segal claimed to have located Helena, and she was a well-known drug user in the community. Like, she would go hard. She would do drugs with some other people, for example, Greg Mitchell, who was her boyfriend at the time. And witnesses basically said that Helena had admitted to committing these crimes, and several people remember her wearing similar clothes to what Jeffrey described. So maybe things weren't quite as they seemed with Jeffrey. So in October of 1970, Jeffrey's senior military officer from the army issued a report saying he didn't do this and he wanted the charges to be dismissed, and he recommended that the authorities go and check Helena out a bit more. So in December then, Jeffrey received honorable discharge from the army and he moved back to New York, and pretty soon after that, he went back to work. Oh. Now, I think one of the most interesting parts about this case is some of the media appearances he did. Oh, Jeffrey. There was one interview in particular that he did where he was like making jokes about having been looked into as a suspect, and like, I don't know, I've only found a tiny little clip, but it gives me a weird, uneasy feeling. Like, imagine if someone was making jokes like, haha, can you believe they looked into me for killing them all? You'd be like, I mean, yeah. Like,
my wife came home and we had a before bedtime drink, really, and watched the beginning of a late night talk show.
He knew how to do it, as we say in the talk show trade. His affect is wrong, totally wrong.
I don't think he once mentioned about, let's get the murderers, my family's been killed, but I remember him grinning like a Cheshire cat.
Do you know what I mean? I just feel like he comes across as like a smug little Like, even if there weren't these allegations against him, I just feel like after seeing that footage, I'm just kind of like, oh, dude, like you're kind of creepy, and he's got this weird, egotistical, superficial charm, and it's very unsettling. Let me know if you also feel that way. But after this particular appearance, a lot of people that knew Jeffrey pretty much turned against him because they also got that feeling. And one of these people is actually Freddie Kassab, who was his stepfather-in-law. And Freddie Kassab had actually testified for Jeffrey's innocence in the Article 32 hearing. But he was shocked at Jeffrey's behavior. He was like, why is he being so, like, And Jeffrey also refused to give him a full transcript of the Article 32 hearing, which he found weird. But eventually when he got his hands on this transcript, he was like, what? Because, There were a lot of inconsistencies in Jeffrey's testimony. For example, Jeffrey claimed that he had been almost fatally injured in the attacks, but Freddy visited him about 18 hours after they happened, and Jeffrey was just sitting up in bed having a meal with like hardly any bandages, and like he was grand. Jeffrey also made some contradictory and wild claims. For example, he told Kassab that him and a couple of army friends tracked down the guys that did the attacks and killed one of them. And he refused to give details about who this person was, and he later said that it was just a lie to put Freddy's persistence to find the killers to rest. If that is not the most suspicious thing, I just don't know what is. All of this makes Jeffrey look so guilty. First of all, because he's lying in his testimony. Second of all, because if he goes after these people who allegedly killed Colette and the kids, it was just more likely that Jeffrey would get found out. I'm just saying, there's just if he didn't do anything, and if he didn't have anything to hide, why would he tell Freddy that he had killed the killers? Like, so because Freddy's suspicions were just as high as mine are right now, he went to the crime scene and he went through all the physical evidence with the authorities, and he also came to the conclusion that Jeffrey did it. So there was so much legal back and forth, like he couldn't be indicted because he'd already been investigated by the army, and then there was bail, and there was this and there was that. But eventually he was brought to trial for the murders of Colette, Kimberly and Kristen. And the trial started on the 16th of July 1979, which is over 9 years after they died. So even if it wasn't him, at this point somebody who carried out these brutal murders had been just walking around living their life, which is very scary as a citizen of the world that can happen. And now I'm just kind of like, God, I wonder how many people I've just walked past on the street that have brutally murdered another person. So now I'm going to get to what came to light in the trial. So there was an Esquire magazine from 1970 that had a very detailed article on the Manson family murders, which, side note, is like a whole other thing that I could do a whole other video on. But essentially it's the same kind of thing with gruesome family murders, blaming it on hippies, that kind of stuff. And that had only happened 6 months prior to the MacDonald family killings. The prosecution claimed that this is where Jeffrey got his idea to blame the murders on a hippie gang. Also in the trial, an FBI lab technician and analyst came to testify and to basically talk about Jeffrey's pajama top. So like I said before, his pajama top was supposedly around his wrists, and that's what he was using to defend himself from the 3 men attacking him with an ice pick. And there were 48 small cylindrical holes in this pajama top. But this FBI lab technician said that Jeffrey would have had to been completely stationary for this to have happened. Now, can you imagine being attacked by 3 men and just being like, I just can't see that happening. Like, you'd be like, oh Jesus, flailing your arms around everywhere. But my only counter argument to that would be maybe 1 or 2 of these men were pinning him down, and that's why he was stationary. But again, like, surely you'd be still moving in some way, you'd be trying to get them off you. And also, I feel like if he was held down by 1 or 2 of these men, wouldn't he have said that in his account of that night? Also, by folding this pajama top a particular way, you would have been able to create the 48 holes that were in it with only 21 thrusts of the ice pick. Now, remember, Colette was stabbed 21 times with an ice pick. It was also in an identical pattern. So they reenacted this struggle, and there were 2 things to note. So first off, if he was using this pajama top to defend himself, the holes would have been kind of jagged and like almost like rips. They wouldn't have been the perfect cylindrical holes that they were. And secondly, it would have been highly likely that he would have had defensive wounds on his hands. Like, in the demonstration when they did this struggle, the person who was like Jeff in this situation had defensive wounds on his hands. So it would have been very unlikely that he wouldn't have had any defensive wounds on his hands if that was the type of struggle that was going on. And Jeff, after these attacks, didn't have defensive wounds on his hands. Then there was another piece of evidence that was brought into court that damaged his defense a lot as well, and it was an audio tape. And it was basically a tape of Jeffrey being interviewed by the investigators after the attacks had happened. When they started asking Jeffrey questions about like him carrying out the attacks and just kind of interrogating him, he became defensive, angry, emotional, which isn't that unusual because if he didn't actually do it, of course that's gonna happen too, but he just was like, what could make you possibly think that I would carry out these horrible murders to my beautiful family in cold blood? And their response to that was to confront him with the information that they knew about his extramarital affairs. To which he replies, "Oh, you guys are more thorough than I thought." Oh, Jeff. But still, there was no clear motive as to why Jeffrey would have carried out these murders. So at this point, the defense call Helena to testify. And obviously they're expecting a confession from her because she had admitted to it in the past. However, Helena testified that she had no recollection of that night and she doesn't know where she was or what she was doing because of her drug abuse. It's very possible that that was true, but it's also a bit like, ugh. But also there was no physical evidence to actually tie her to the crime scene anyway. So the jury deliberated for 6 hours, which is a pretty short amount of time, and they found Jeffrey guilty on all counts. He was found guilty of 1 count of first-degree murder for the murder of Kristen and 2 counts of second-degree murder for the murders of Colette and Kimberly. So he got 3 life sentences for that. Now, Jeffrey being the... I don't want to be too against him here, but being the kind of narcissistic person that he was, he he wanted a book written about his story and his innocence and how he was fighting for justice for himself and everything. So he asks this guy, Joe McGinnis, to write the book for him. And Jeffrey was expecting it to be all about how he was wrongly charged and this was wrong and he was innocent and blah de blah. But, and this is what Joe McGinnis agreed to, but when he actually started digging into the case, Joe McGinnis decided, damn, he is guilty, and basically wrote the book portraying him as a narcissistic sociopath who murdered his whole family. So, Jeffrey was pissed. He was not happy with this at all, so he sued, naturally. This book that Joe McGinnis wrote was called Fatal Vision, and soon after this, I'm not sure how soon, but a little bit after this, there was another book that was brought out called Fatal Justice, and it actually had a lot of opposing claims. So first of all, it claimed that the army botched the crime scene and that they allowed far too many people to trample it and it was totally contaminated. Secondly, it claimed that the neighbors of the MacDonald family spotted the intruders, but there were so many people matching the descriptions that Jeffrey gave and none of these people were ever found to have any involvement in the crimes. It also claimed that there was evidence of other people at the crime scene that hadn't been accounted for. So they thought this because there was evidence of a bloody palm print on the headboard of the bed, and it didn't match Jeffrey. There were brown hairs found under the fingernails of the 2 young girls, a brown hair in the palm of Colette, a blonde wig hair, which the government then claimed to have been from a doll or something, but then it was too long to be from any of the dolls that the girls had because it was like 10 to 20 inches long. And there were also black wool fibers that were found on the club that couldn't be matched to anything in the house. Now the actual case records say that there was no bloody palm print, so there was speculation as to whether there was or there wasn't, which I feel like, would you not have crime scene pictures that you can verify that? So there's just a whole load of like, what is going on here? That everyone just reported everything arse ways. Like, Now, this book also claims that the judge in this case, Judge Dupree, may have had a prejudice against Jeffrey because his son-in-law was involved in the initial army investigation. It also claimed that Helena Stokely had confessed to being in the house on the evening of the murders, and she confessed this to the prosecutor James Blackburn, and another guy that was in the room was the US Marshal Jimmy Britt. And according to Britt, Blackburn said to her, "If you testify what you've just told me, I will indict you for murder." And the next day she testified that she had no recollection of that night. So it's all very sketchy. The book also said that given any evidence of Jeffrey's possible innocence, that he should be given a new trial, and also that Jeffrey may have just been a victim of a cover-up by higher-ups in Fort Bragg whose children were associated with Helena and her friends. That last part was highly speculative, but it did say that, and it's just like, so at this point, oh, everything is just so messed up. So after all this, Jeffrey appealed his sentence on the grounds that because of the 9-year delay in his trial taking place, that his right to a speedy trial was violated, and he was released on a $100,000 bail in 1980, and he went back to work. But obviously a lot of people were like, hold up, what? So in 1981 then, the US Supreme Court were basically saying, you know what, we're open to reconsider all of this, and they started to have oral arguments, and they ruled that Jeffrey's right to a speedy trial had not been violated. So he was rearrested and returned to federal prison, and he still had his 3 consecutive life sentences with time served, blah blah blah. And then there was this whole thing, his defense lawyers were trying to get him out on bail again, and that was refused. And of course after this, finally, I don't know why this took so long, but his licenses to practice medicine were revoked. And there were a few times over the years where Jeffrey appealed his sentence one more time and he was refused, and this whole time he's maintaining his innocence. There were also some legal issues regarding Helena and her potential role in the murders, as well as her potential fear of the defense attorneys impacting her testimony and all this stuff. So I don't know, just a lot of, it's just really messy. It's just okay, so obviously all of this is quite messy, but we get to a point where over the years, as he's appealing and all this, DNA science is getting a lot better. And they basically got to look into the evidence a little bit more. So we all know Helena, and if you remember, Glenn Mitchell was her boyfriend at the time of the murders. Both of their DNA was ruled out to have been on any of the physical evidence, and that hair that was found in Colette's palm was matched to Jeffrey. It also matched the hair that was in the master bed on the bed covers, and also in Kristen's bed on top of the sheets, which, I mean, it's not going to be all that unusual, because if you're somebody's father, you're going to put them to bed, your hair might fall in like that. I don't think that's exactly damning. And of course your own hair is going to be in your own bed. Like my bed is covered with my hair. But there's one thing that gets me, and that's, there were 3 hairs found, one on Colette and Jeffrey's bed, one in Colette's body outline, and one beneath Kristen's fingernail, and these hairs did not match any of the MacDonald family members, which is very, very unusual. So I was like, oh my god, what if it was Helena or Glenn's? But obviously they didn't match anything at the crime scene. So we're left with this question, like, who did these hairs belong to? That's very, very strange. And this was the reason that Jeffrey appealed his sentence once again, but again he was denied. So let's talk parole. In 2005, in May, Jeffrey had a parole hearing, and it was immediately denied. So at this point, they set the next parole hearing for May of 2020. And I saw this date, and I was like, I'm sure I'm not the only one that, because I've been home for the majority of the last 3 to 4 months, I was like, is it May yet? But for those of you who are in the same boat as me, it's June. So like, May was last month. So I was like, oh, and I did look this up and there hasn't been any recent updates. At this point, Jeffrey is 76 years old, so he has spent the majority of his life in prison, but maybe we'll get some updates over the next month or two. If I get any updates, I'll obviously let you know. Yeah, so somehow Jeffrey ended up moving on and getting married again, which but these two had known each other before, like years and years before, but in 1997 she reached out to him and I think sent a letter to him when he was in prison, offering any help like with his case and that kind of stuff. And they built a friendship and it eventually turned romantic and became very intense, so they got married when he was in prison. Jeffrey's not exactly the catch he was when he was in his early 20s, you know what I mean? Okay, guys, we got through it. Let's conclude. There is so much controversy over this case. Some people say, yes, he did it without a doubt. Other people are on the fence. Other people say, no way. First of all, I just want to say the way he behaved in that interview was bizarre. It was oddly smug and superficially charming, both of which are traits of psychopathy and a lot of the time of serial killers, which I think it would be very lucky for him to get off so easily in the attacks, that he just had one stab wound, mild concussion, like a couple of cuts and bruises. Also, the way he was defending himself didn't make sense when they did the demonstration in court, and that would have been the only reason that he wasn't fatally injured. But if he did do it, why did he do it? There was nothing really in the way of like phone records or anything, but although like obviously you wouldn't have had a mobile phone in those days, but I'm sure they would have had a landline. And it just would have been interesting to see if there was any infidelity on Colette's part. I don't want to disrespect her in any way, but just in case, so just because we don't have a motive. I also find it hard to believe that anybody would enter a house to murder 3 people without their own weapons, because all of the weapons had been inside the house. Unless it wasn't their intention to murder them, but then why would they murder them when they didn't intend to? I don't know. Anyway. On the other hand, then you have Helena, who was this drug-crazed hippie, or so she was portrayed in the media. But essentially, if you are a long-term drug abuser, who knows what your mind is capable of making you do? Maybe she did do it, like she admitted to it, but then she was albeit allegedly threatened that she'd be put away for first-degree murder if she told that story, so she said she had no recollection of it. I just feel like that whole thing is a bit fishy, I don't know. But then also, if Helena was involved in some way, where were the other 3 guys? She could have easily gotten a reduced sentence if she gave their names or something, like if she had testified that she'd done it. And just like how would those other 3 guys get away with it for so long and leave no DNA evidence?
Unless one of them left the hairs behind that couldn't be matched to anybody.
Lots to think about. I would love to know where you stand on this case. It's just so unbelievably gruesome and was very distressing to research, to be quite honest. There was a lot of information in this one and I really hope I've done it justice and not made it too heavy for you. I do want to thank Matt for sending this one in. Thank you, Matt. Obviously the biggest thing is in this case is just how absolutely awful it is. For those who have been left behind and who were close friends or family members of these people who were brutally murdered, my heart goes out to them. But that brings me to the end of this case. Thank you so much for watching this video, guys. If you enjoyed it, please give me a like and leave a comment below. I would honestly love to know what you think about this one, because I do feel like it might be a bit split, so that's always interesting. Leave a comment, let's chat. My Instagram is katephilpott_YT, and I will see you next week. Bye!